Calm down. Everything's going to be just fine. My name's Leon. I'm under the President's order to rescue you.
What? My father?
That's right. And I have to get you out of here. Now come with me.
My name's Leon. I'm hearing the President's orders and... that went well.
But it wasn't.
If I was ever to do some kind of personal top 10 games of all time list, the 2005 industry-defining masterpiece, Resident Evil 4, would be up there in the top 3. The original release of Resident Evil 4 was a significant event, both for the franchise and the industry, and was directed by Shinji Mikami, in the only time he's ever directed a sequel to an IP. Before the game's release, the Resident Evil franchise was in a bit of a downward spiral of somewhat mediocre spin-offs, even after the fantastic remake of the first game in 2001, also directed by Mikami. But the particular style of gameplay in the survival horror genre was also beginning to feel tired.
Why don't you do us all a favor and leave before the audience gets pissed off?
Resident Evil 4, after a lengthy development period where one early prototype ended up becoming the Devil May Cry franchise, would abandon many of the design staples of the survival horror genre Resident Evil was largely responsible for popularizing, like the fixed camera angle perspectives and the slower paced action and tank controls. Instead, it moved everything into a full 3D perspective, with the camera hovering behind Leon, the rookie cop now turned government agent protagonist from RE2, and shifted the focus from the backtracking puzzle gameplay into a fast-paced and frenetic action game, with Leon being much more agile and capable than any previous character. But even with this drastic change in pacing and gameplay style, Resident Evil 4 also retained a lot of elements that defined the series and genre, with ammo and health items still being limited, inventory management was still present but a lot more refined. Leon still couldn't move and shoot at the same time, but this wasn't much of an issue since the new over-the-shoulder aiming style allowed for newfound precision.
Nice one, Leon.
The game's tone also seemed to fully embrace the camp of an 80s horror film, as previous games had been wrestling with settling on a consistent tone, and never seeming to find a balance of seriousness and camp. Leon boasted a strong, dry bravado as he spat out campy one-liners to all the game's villains, in a very Japanese interpretation of an American action hero.
Where's the satisfying sound of one's impalement?
Don't fall for this old trick.
So maybe you have 9 lives, but it doesn't matter now, Mr. Kennedy. I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
And yet, simultaneously, Resident Evil 4 somehow also managed to retain a strong horror atmosphere throughout, with the palpable sense of isolation and the many unnerving monsters thrown in Leon's way, as he tries to save the President's daughter Ashley.
You stay here with Leon. He is better with the ladies.
I first played Resident Evil 4 back in 2006 on the PlayStation 2, and like so many others, fell in love with it, and it became one of my all-time favourite games. Can I also just say that I'm a bit tired of the revisionist history narrative that the PlayStation 2 port is somehow the worst version of the game, which is just objectively wrong, especially when you compare it to the atrocious PC port that followed it. But also, every port that followed the PS2 version would include all of the extra content it had, and I can guarantee there is a large majority of players who first experienced the game on PS2, as I only knew like 2 people who had a GameCube when I was a teenager.
So it is true.
As I stated earlier, Resident Evil 4 would also become a significant event for the gaming industry, with the over-the-shoulder aiming perspective becoming the standard for almost all third-person shooters, and many franchises like Dead Space, The Last of Us, and The Evil Within, another title directed by Shinji Mikami, were heavily influenced by Resident Evil 4.
Same place as the photographs.
As much of a landmark and pivotal title Resident Evil 4 was for the industry, for the series itself it became a bit of a point of contention for some fans, as the numerous sequels and spin-offs that followed could never seem to recapture the magic of RE4, with some even claiming that it had ruined the franchise, which is a laughably bad take.
That's stupid.
That is until 2017's Resident Evil 7 would shake up the series once again, in very similar ways to RE4 by stripping everything back to core ideas and a simple rescue the princess plot. Something Zero Punctuation has pointed out is the Resident Evil cycle. The success of RE7 led the way to the fantastic remake of Resident Evil 2 in 2019, and set us on the course to this 2023 remake of Resident Evil 4. Skipping my best girl Claire Redfield and her solo game Code Veronica, I guess because they're not sure how to handle some of that game's peculiar story elements.
What are they doing?
When the remake was announced last year, my immediate reaction was,
No thanks, bro.
and this was for a few reasons, some that I'll go into a bit more detail later on. But this largely stemmed from the notion of updating Resident Evil 4 to be homogeneous with the current standard of recent games, and because the early teasers seemed to suggest a drastic shift in tone, moving in a direction that was very different from the original, and that all of the edges were going to be sanded off, or completely cut, like in the Resident Evil 3 remake, resulting in RE4 losing its identity, along with just the fact that RE4 has such a revered and important legacy that remaking it felt like a massive uphill battle.
Got that right.
When Resident Evil 2 was remade, it felt like it made perfect sense to remake that game because of how dated it is now by today's standards. Whereas remaking Resident Evil 4 just felt weird considering it's responsible for a lot of the framework used to update Resident Evil 2. So the fact that Resident Evil 4 Remake actually turned out to be pretty good was a pleasant surprise for me and how much I enjoyed most of the experience. Although some of my fears about what was going to be changed were validated. But let's start with the positives, shall we?
Good job, Leon. Have fun?
Now, if you're somehow completely unfamiliar with Resident Evil 4, the story takes place 6 years after the events of Resident Evil 2, and sees Leon S. Kennedy returning as a fully trained government agent, sent into a lonely rural part of Europe to rescue the president's daughter from a cult of religious zealots called the Los Illuminados,
That's a mouthful.
who are being controlled by a parasite known as Las Plagas, with nothing but a fancy jacket and a pistol with 10 bullets. In quite a stark contrast to the Resident Evil 3 remake that I recently covered, what shocked me about this remake is just how closely it resembles and replicates so much of the original game, from the story cinematics to the actual level design, that there were times during this incredibly long campaign that almost felt like I was playing a Shadow of the Colossus style remaster remake, with some areas being almost one-to-one recreations of their original counterparts. If you ever played the remake of Resident Evil 1, a lot of the same design philosophies were used to update the game's artwork, that play with your expectations and memory of the original's design. Many of the locations from the original return largely intact, but to keep things feeling fresh, the way you approach these areas have been shifted around in different ways, like sometimes there will be a new area in between them, or the location itself will be reversed and see you entering it from the opposite side that you did in the original. Whereas other areas have been repurposed to serve different functions, like this cave shack was originally a shop for the merchant, but here in the remake it houses a quest item that requires a simple puzzle to solve. That's not to say that areas from the original haven't been cut, but for the most part in the remake, the areas cut were actually replaced by new locations or set pieces. Like one of the standout new inclusions is a set piece in the castle involving an El Gigante that is lobbing projectiles at you as you try to make your way to a cannon to take it out.
Another one. You guys are really starting to become a giant pain in my ass.
As for the set pieces that did actually just get cut out entirely, these include the gondola ride in the village, the cage fight with the Garrador, the massive lava room, the giant Salazar robot statue chase, the bulldozer chase in the island tunnels, this cool looking outpost area, and the boss fight against It, which was one of my favorite monsters from the original.
Why don't I introduce you to it? It should keep you busy.
Can't remember the name, huh? A senior moment, perhaps.
Oh,
But you can rest easy knowing that the infamously difficult water room is pretty much 100% intact here, even though I did find it somewhat easier in the remake. But this may also be because of how familiar I am with the original, which is as good of a segue into the gameplay as any, and probably about as much has changed mechanically as has remained exactly the same as the original. The attaché case inventory management is the same as the original and Resident Evil Village, but now features the quality of life improvement of assigning your weapons to hotkeys or the D-pad, much like recent games. Leon can now move and shoot at the same time, which combined with the faster weapon switching meant that some significant changes had to be made to the combat encounters in the game. Something that becomes apparent very quickly during the iconic opening village battle, as the enemy count has drastically increased, along with a variety of new AI behaviours, although they're still not free of some amusing jank.
This is bullshit!
Some Ganados will try to rush you and grab you to set you up for follow-up attacks, while there seem to be more that are strategically placed around arenas as projectile launchers than seen in the original. There are some new and redesigned enemies too, with a new addition being these brutes. While these particular castle zealots in the original are upgraded to these absolute assholes who can affect Leon's movement and vision using the Las Plagas, so make sure to kill them as fast as possible.
Leon! He's back!
Leon's melee abilities return too, with you being able to execute certain attacks after shooting enemies in particular weak points like their legs or right in the face. There is also the addition of stealth mechanics and attacks, very much like the ones in The Evil Within and The Last of Us, with the caveat being that your knives have a durability limit and have to be repaired or replaced. Something that was likely done to balance out the other notable new addition of Leon being able to parry pretty much every melee attack in the game. Yes, even the iconic chainsaw insta-kill can be parried, which did feel a bit weird, as part of what made that original kill iconic was how abruptly it would just end you, almost as if Dr. Salvador looked at your full health bar and was like, why don't you show that to someone who gives a shit?
Chainsaw.
Despite that one exception, the parry system is pretty cool once you get the hang of it, and definitely racks up the tension during the two fights against Krauser.
I see you have an eye for things. Gun's not just about shooting, it's about reloading.
The merchant mechanic returns, again much like it did in Resident Evil Village, selling new weapons and upgrades like damage output and ammo capacity, but there's a new addition of side quests available that reward you with spinels, a currency used to purchase exclusive items. This isn't a bad idea in of itself, as some of these quests require you to shoot a collection of blue medals in certain areas, or backtrack somewhere else to kill a special monster. But then there are some quests that require you to double back somewhere and kill a handful of rats, which is just bottom tier Bethesda side quest design.
I think I've got something that suits your experience. Arvina Phyllis has some problem with rats in her house.
Rats.
With BBs.
The merchant's shooting range also makes a return in the remake, this time rewarding you with tokens that can be spent on a slot machine that will randomly give you a cute charm based on the classic character models. You can then equip 3 of these, all of which have different perks like discounts on certain purchases, additional ammo crafting percentages, and healing buffs. I would highly recommend saving your game before spending your tokens however, as the RNG nature of the drops can be really annoying if you end up with duplicates.
My hero.
And that just leaves the last gameplay system to discuss, with that being the AI and mechanics surrounding Ashley, who accompanies you throughout much of the campaign. Ashley has always been something of a point of contention and discourse of the original, with the constant narrative you'd see being that she was really annoying to escort and that somehow her AI was bad, which was really just a long way of saying that you sucked at the game. The addition of Ashley into the combat loop was to test how well you had learnt the fundamentals of combat, and her AI was designed to keep her out of combat as much as possible, since she would follow you extremely closely and hover behind you when aiming, or if she ended up in your line of fire, she would duck immediately. The only time she would ever end up in harm's way would be as a result of you playing poorly 99% of the time, like allowing yourself to be flanked and surrounded, which is something you should have learnt how to avoid at that point. You could even make her hide in boxes placed in certain locations, something you can also do in the remake and Ashley now reacts to.
Stay here.
What? Okay.
With that said, she of course has been updated in the remake, with her being a slightly more advanced version of Ellie from The Last of Us, in that she doesn't have a health bar but can be incapacitated by enemies and then killed if Leon doesn't pick her up. She does have 2 different follow modes that you can give her, one where she sticks by you at all times, and another where she hangs back and moves a bit more freely to avoid enemies. Though, to be honest, I just kept her right by me much like the original. Perhaps this is more useful on the higher difficulties. The changes don't just end at her basic AI, however, as out of all the characters in this remake, Ashley has definitely been the most carefully and thoughtfully rewritten and redesigned character in the game, and has actually become one of my favourite female characters in the series now, alongside Claire and Rose Winters. A lot of this has definitely been influenced by The Last of Us, with Ashley being a lot more vocal and reactive to the environment around her and events that transpire, much like Ellie would also do. She even reacts to you throwing an egg at her.
You... What?
There are also more moments throughout the campaign where she will actively help you, like the first fight against the armoured Plagas, and moments where you have to cooperate together, and then also be quick on your toes to help her out, such as this area where she holds up a bridge for you to access another area, and you then need to get back to it quickly before she gets ambushed. Ashley also has so much more character depth in the remake, particularly with the way she builds a rapport with Leon through their much more playful and flirtatious banter with each other, that I found myself genuinely caring about her and not just her ballistics.
So, you do a lot of missions like this?
Well, yeah, but I'm not used to having such good company.
Is that a compliment?
Take it however you want.
We'll take that as a yes.
Take it however you want.
And I really don't understand those who think she looks older and uglier in the remake, especially when she's modelled off these 2 models.
Seems this isn't your first time running from creeps.
I can't tell if that's meant to be a compliment.
Before I move into the things that disappointed about this remake and what fears I had which were confirmed, I should preface that this is definitely still a very good game and a great experience when separated from the legacy of the original game. Meaning, if you have somehow never played Resident Evil 4, most of the issues I'm about to discuss won't matter to you, and since the game sold 3 million copies in 2 days, the majority seem to be in love with this remake anyway. One of my biggest concerns about the remake was that they were going to sand off much of the 80s camp tone and make it a lot more serious and, in turn, more generic, which they have. Leon in the remake is a lot broodier, and a lot of his lines are a lot more serious in tone, with a much more direct delivery from the new voice actor Nick Apostolides, who I actually really liked as the younger Leon in the Resident Evil 2 remake, as his voice captured the more unsure and naive Leon, along with being reminiscent of the original actor Paul Haddad.
There's no reason for us to stay any longer than necessary. Let's split up, look for any survivors, and get out of here.
Are you alright? Police chopper, it just came out of nowhere. Don't worry about me. Just get yourself to safety.
However, I found his take on the older Leon in Infinite Darkness a bit inconsistent, and for me, the case remains the same here in Resident Evil 4 Remake. I can't help but feel that his voice just doesn't suit the older Leon as well as Paul Mercier and Matt Mercer's voices did, with their perfect blends of low grit with snarky confidence.
Monsters. Guess after this there'll be one less to worry about.
There was no one at the controls. Zombie Express.
There was also a couple of times where Leon reminded me of Sebastian from The Evil Within, with his straight seriousness.
What the fuck?
What the fuck?
I knew it.
I knew it.
But there are also moments sprinkled throughout where Leon will make a genuinely funny quip, that for me kind of feel like they come out of nowhere.
I am flattered. What am a one-lady type of guy?
But he wasn't, and he regretted it the moment he said it.
Given how the tone is largely much more serious, it can kind of feel like sometimes they're trying to have their cake and eat it, as Leon isn't anywhere near as consistent with these quips as he was in the original.
I've been expecting you, my brethrens.
No thanks, bro.
I would like you to hand the girl there over to me. Now.
Yeah, fat chance, Ramon. The girl's just fine. With me.
It's been 6 hours since our last transmission. I was starting to get worried.
Don't you mean lonely?
You've been radio silent for 3 hours. Are you all right?
Yeah, I'm fine. Won't let it happen again.
You're no fun.
Another factor that contributes to this is how the main villains of the game take a bit of a backseat in the story, as in the original they hacked into Leon's radio and would constantly call him up and taunt him, which is where a lot of the game's more memorable dialogue was, particularly with the character of Salazar, who you saw and heard from frequently in the original, to the point that when you get to the final tower of the castle, both you and Leon are completely sick of him.
So nice you could join us, Mr. Scott Kennedy.
You again.
Whereas in the remake, you only see him a couple of times and hear him twice over a speaker. The same goes for Sadler, who Leon doesn't even meet in person until near the end of the campaign. I will say that I did like that more depth was added to the character of Krauser, Leon's former comrade, as their dialogue now makes explicit references to Operation Javier, the story from Darkside Chronicles that originally fleshed out his backstory, and I absolutely would not say no to a DLC that retells that story.
It smells like a battlefield.
As much as I can appreciate how this remake makes an effort to bring more horror into it, a lot of the time to me it felt like they were never fully prepared to commit to it either, as I said before, trying to have that cake and eat it. Like, for example, in Chapter 2, Leon loses all of his equipment and you're given a knife with a tutorial on stealth kills, and my first thought was, oh, are we about to do an actual stealth sequence? But then I only had to stealth kill 2 guys and got all of my gear back a minute later. I also then found that the Garradors weren't as scary in the remake either, given the new stealth mechanics, and probably because I've played so many stealth-based horror games like The Last of Us and Alien Isolation, with insta-kill enemies, that I just didn't really find them that intimidating, and I got the trophy for killing one with just knives on my first attempt. Thank God though that the regenerators were still terrifying, and this was the only sequence in the game that resembled a stalker-like mechanic, as they were unkillable as far as I could tell until you found the thermal scope that highlighted their weak spots, which was a welcome reprieve after the last 4 games heavily utilizing stalker mechanics.
How do you like this?
The last few issues I have are just minor presentation things, and I'm not talking about the graphics at all because holy shit this game looks amazing, even on the PlayStation 4 Pro, and even without the fancy hair strand system seen on PC, it all looks very attractive. And the PC version is pretty well optimized in my experience. Yes, I have both, with it running really well on my rig with an RTX 3050 and 16 gigs of RAM, which meant that I could experience the hair strands and Ashley's biblically accurate outfit.
Ow! You pervert!
The presentation nitpicks are just to do with the way information is conveyed in some cutscenes compared to the original. Like, take the lake for example. Leon looks out onto the lake with his binoculars, and we hear his reactions to what he sees, but unlike the original, we never get to see his reactions, which I feel helped you connect with him in the original. Then when you're attacked by the Del Lago, the original had a shot showing the boat's anchor attaching to it, quickly explaining how you're being pulled around the lake. The remake doesn't do that, and I can't help but feel that a complete newbie might be a little confused at first.
Hasta luego.
Or how I feel that the hasta luego line didn't land the same way, because even though he still said it, we didn't get to see his smug face when he delivered it. Just these little things the original did to effectively communicate everything it wanted to.
Mission accomplished, right?
With all of that said, however, and I really have said an awful lot, at the end of the day, the Resident Evil 4 remake I think does a lot more right in its mission to update the beloved classic up to more modern standards, especially when compared to the RE3 remake. I predicted most of the places where they would misstep, in my opinion of course, and ultimately the remake as a whole winds up feeling more evolutionary than revolutionary like the original was, which just goes back to what I said when it was first announced, that it would be an uphill battle to recapture the lightning in a bottle magic of the original, that was such a pivotal and influential title in the industry. And I still feel that it was an odd move to remake Resident Evil 4 after 2021's Resident Evil Village, which felt a lot like a spiritual remake given the strong similarities between the two. And I imagine the deja vu must be weird for newcomers who played Village but not the original before going into this remake.
Guess there's no going back now.
To sum up, as I said much earlier, I was pleasantly surprised with Resident Evil 4 Remake, and I certainly didn't hate my time spent with it. Well, maybe except the Salazar fight. A lot of people really love this remake, and I'm happy that they do. To me, it was fine, which I was afraid of, but I enjoyed it a lot more than some other games in the series, and I'll definitely replay it more than I have 7 and Village. Anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed my examination of the Resident Evil 4 remake, and do let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you're feeling generous, consider pledging to my Patreon to support the channel. Until next time, stay safe out there everyone. Remember,
you'll not only need cash, but guts to buy that weapon, stranger.
And I'll see you all in the next video.
Thank you.